Okay, in part 3 of this week's lecture, I'm going to talk and define what the sociological imagination is, which is something we hope you can develop throughout this course. So, the idea of the sociological imagination, a kind of critically inflected sociological way of seeing the world, was coined by C. Wright Mills, who's a very prominent and famous sociologist. Essentially, the sociological imagination, relates a little bit to structure and agency. Mills argues that we need to kind of, the quote there is, public issues must be revealed by relating them to personal troubles and vice versa. So again, it's that kind of relationship, what he calls a vivid awareness of the relationship between the private experience and wider society. So let's think about that through a few examples. The health system is a really good example. If you're ill, if you're sick, if you catch a disease, if you get an injury, this is an individual problem. It's a personal trouble for you. But in terms of then, seeking out medical advice or, getting an operation, these things that'll help solve that problem to, help you become healthy again. These are much more public issues because, hospital funding will relate to, how many beds there are. Certain diseases get more research funding over others, so they'll have, more possibilities of, having cures and stuff like that. The stark example is that, if you die on a waiting list to get a particular operation, that's a private trouble, but really, it relates to public issues in terms of power, structures, funding, priorities, politics, all these different things. So Mills wants us to kind of think about how what seem like individual issues, whether that's things like illiteracy or obesity, unemployment, or, even living near, say, hazardous waste, these can have, obviously real detrimental effects on individual lives, on someone's agency, but they're not really always they're not necessarily individually to be blamed for those things, because these things tend to relate to wider public issues, again, where that kind of agency is embedded in all these structures. So Mills develops 4 different kind of phenomena, or I suppose orientations, to think through the sociological imagination. There's the historical, the structural, the cultural, and the critical, and I'll go through those briefly one by one now. The historical basically asks the key sociological question of how has the past influenced the present. And I'll go through all these in a little bit more detail in a sec. The cultural gets us to think about how does culture impact on our lives, and culture particularly here in terms of norms and traditions. The structural, I've gone through that a lot already. What role does social organisations play in individual lives? And then these 3 kind of combine to kind of move towards this kind of critical question. Why are things this way? Who benefits? Who doesn't it? And what alternatives exist? Now, just, you'll probably talk about this stuff in tutes. It's important not to really worry too much about boxing particular phenomena or problems in one of these things. They really all interrelate. It's a kind of toolbox to help us think through sociological problems. So first, the historical factors. How can we learn from the past? How to kind of historical events influence the way that we think about today? How can we learn from them? How in many ways are kind of historical events still present in the way that we live in today's world? In particular, we can think about this in terms of inequality, discrimination, things like racism and colonialism. How do people's experiences, how does their ancestry affect the way that they live today in their places in society? Things like the stolen generation and slavery are only like a couple, 3 or 4 generations ago, and sometimes, 1 or 2. So these have profound effects on the ways that people live today. I think the cartoon there about the reality of reverse racism is a kind of nice historical synopsis of that. So how do historical injustices leave a legacy? How do these kind of things in the past operate in the present? We can also think about this through kind of temporality and through knowledge and through truth, these kind of concepts. I mean, when we think about the concept of truth, there was a time when people thought the Earth was flat, and then, scientific knowledge builds up this knowledge to see that the Earth is round. Who knows in the future? We have string theory that says there's 9 or 11 dimensions, and, our understanding of the here and now is very contextual on the history, flows through the present into the future. We can also use the historical kind of perspective to think about current social problems, and the use of asbestos is a really good example. So, at one stage, one scientific endeavour made this kind of material to build houses out of. It's used extensively throughout the Western world, particularly a lot in Australia. Years later, a different kind of science finds out that it gives you cancer. So, the truth there of what it means in society changes contextually. But then when you start thinking about power and what happens next, you have these multinational corporations covering up or trying to minimise the damage to basically ensure their profits, and that essentially means that people died unnecessarily. So the historical factors there about, how that kind of particular thing, asbestos, is thought of differently through time, how that affects the people that are using it, how that kind of public issue and private trouble plays off as a way of thinking about that kind of trajectory from the past to the present. Secondly, there's cultural factors. What influence does cultural traditions have and our social behaviours and the way that we interact? How do different values and norms come about from historical traditions and institutions and religions? What effects do these things have on social trends? And particularly, I think this is useful for thinking about how we conceive of things that are normal or abnormal. And that kind of dichotomy is a real kind of structuring cultural mechanism that influences the way that we live. For the most part, people want to be seen as good citizens, good parents, good workers, all that kind of stuff. So we tend to kind of follow those scripts, and I'll talk about that a little bit in part 4 when I talk about Goffman. But what cultures do is they kind of provide us with these kind of ways of living. A really easy way to kind of point out the cultural factors is food, right? So in Australia, it's, very much normal to eat meat and cows, but in India, that's kind of seen as, offensive. In Australia, we're offended by eating whales. So there's all these kind of things that we kind of eat to put in our bodies as fuel to live, but there's cultural kind of traditions, cultural structures that, I suppose, impel or socialise different groups of people around the world to have different understandings of what's good and bad, tasteful and vulgar and all that kind of stuff. Religions are particularly important in creating cultural norms, and they still have huge influence, even though society is seen as becoming more secular. So again, these are some of the cultural factors we're looking at here. Again, gender relations relate to this, that kind of whole pink and blue thing is a cultural factor. Why isn't it, yellow and green? Why does that even exist? So these are, again, the kind of sociological questions we want to think about. Thirdly, there's structural factors. I've got into this in some depth already in the first 2 sections. It's probably my favourite sociological GIF at all time. Don't watch it for too long. It's kind of mesmerising. But again, these are those kind of structural things I've spoken about a lot already. We can see things like gender, race, ethnicity, age, religion being structural things. How does the state shape the economy? How do things like school, law, politics, algorithms, media, all this kind of stuff influence our place in the world, our trajectory through it, our choices and all that kind of thing. Importantly, how do these things also differ between countries and regions and that kind of stuff as well? And lastly is the critical factors. So the kind of first 3 of the cultural, the structural and the historical get us to ask particular questions, and these lead to these kind of critical questions. Given all that cultural, structural and historical stuff, why are things the way they are now? Who benefits from that? How could things be otherwise? How can sociological perspectives and critique provide a starting point or knowledge or data to, make the world better? Importantly here in terms of the critical factors is also that sociology increasingly needs to be critical of itself. What other voices need to be heard? And this is not just in public debates in terms of who gets to dominate the public sphere and the media, but also within sociology. Sociology is particularly dominated by the Western world, and it's only recently that voices from what we call the Global South are actually becoming more prominent within it, and these voices need to be heard a lot more within sociology itself.